Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another exciting virtual tour with Pretty Gritty Tours and the Foss Waterway Seaport. I'm your guide this evening, but only one of which, Chris Stodinger. I am joined this evening by the fantastic Leah Santini. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself and your expertise to the people here?
Yeah, so my name is Leah. I'm from Seattle and I've lived up here my whole life. I started working with the Foss Waterway back in March when I was a museum studies student, but you can imagine how well museum studies went when everything shut down. So the museum studies went away, but my relationship with the Fossway continued and changed into these virtual tours, which is awesome. Wore my social distancing sweatshirt, so I'm good to go.
Well, we're super thrilled to have you here tonight. We're sort of diving into, if you can excuse another water pun, these racing shells. They're on display in the Foss Waterway Seaport Museum, and sort of the history behind them, and rowing, racing in the Pacific Northwest. A bunch of cool stuff tonight, and for me personally, it's about stomping the Nazis. But I don't want to get ahead of us or your story.
No spoilers.
So I guess we'll take a second, because all of this is made possible by the fact that the Foss Waterway Seaport is continuing to launch these free virtual Thursdays, while the museum is not going to be doing the in-person Free Thursday program the way that it used to be done. They have adapted very quickly on their feet to create this program where you can experience a piece of the history of the Tacoma, and in some cases, greater Pacific Northwest area, for free. And so you get the opportunity to interact, ask questions, engage with us, and hopefully be patient, because I have not done a co-hosted presentation in some time now. The last time I did was with my co-guide Paul, and he really doesn't count. Not necessarily,
no pressure on either of us here.
He's not necessarily knowledgeable about all the topics we talk about, but so it was easy to work with. I'm going to try and keep up with you tonight. And we also have to thank our sponsor tonight, Columbia Bank, who has made this entire experience possible. So let's acknowledge them really quick.
Somewhere around the age of 16, 17, I knew that I wanted to start my own restaurant. I just didn't know how I was gonna do it. Columbia Bank, they were the first one to say, hey, we wanna listen to your story and see what we can do, because we see what you have done. They pretty much held my hand the entire way during the SBA loan process. I was a little guy with a big dream, and they helped make this dream become a reality. My banker is a genius because he's supporting me.
And I can relate full-heartedly, because as a guy with a big dream trying to make something happen, I'm deeply appreciative of Columbia Bank sponsoring these tours. So here we are. So yeah, I will briefly touch on the topic, and then I'll really let you get involved in this whole thing. But essentially, in the Foss Waterway Seaport, there are these racing shells, and I believe there are 3 of them currently on display there. And you were instrumental in doing a lot of the research for those shells, correct?
Yeah, the history behind them was pretty unknown. 2 of them have a name, 1 of them doesn't have a name. So it's really just searching for people who have a connection with the rowing community. There's not a lot online, and what is online is just kind of compiled by those same experts. So I just had to get out there and do some old-fashioned detective work and talk to some people and not just rely on the internet.
Which is so difficult in this day and age, specifically 2020, to do that. So full marks for bravery and intrepid spirit. Yeah. Well, I'll let you take it from here, but I'm going to have questions along the way. And if anybody has questions about this particular topic, please chime in. I'll do my best to moderate as we go.
Okay, and just interrupt me whenever. I might just start babbling along. So the Foss has 3 racing shells, and even though the history behind those 3 specific ones isn't like widely known, the history behind the boat builder and the rowing history, I guess, has gone back to the turn of the century, the 1900s. We'll start with George Pocock, the namesake of these shells. George Pocock was born in 1891 in England, and he began his boat building career in 1904 at the age of 13 as an apprentice to his father at a boathouse. This area in England was the birthplace of competitive rowing, and George fell into that. He raced in single shells down the famous River Thames. At 20 years old in 1911, he and his brother Dick emigrated to British Columbia, where they quickly gained a reputation in the rowing community as skilled builders. They were up in Vancouver building boats, and people noticed. 12 years earlier, in 1889, I wrote down 1989, not the year I was born, but 100 years before.
Totally understandable. I do it all the time.
I don't know what day it is.
100 years really means nothing anymore.
Right, I know. In 1889, was it 89 or 99? It doesn't matter. Before 1900,
there it is.
The University of Washington launched their rowing program. And since 1907, Hiram Conaber was the head coach. And in 1912, he caught wind of the Pocock brothers' reputation and their shell building skills.
And I don't want to interrupt you, but I have to at least punctuate this with Hiram here. He's just like a good-looking dude.
Yeah.
Like, he's just got that like commanding presence.
Yeah, he's like, come down here.
Yeah, right.
Like, okay. So in 1912, he traveled up from Seattle to Vancouver, and with the promise of a 12-shell order, he convinced the brothers to come down to Seattle and build rowing shells for the university. But actually, Dick and their father, who they brought over from England, were the ones who went down to Seattle, and George stayed in Vancouver, and they set up their shop near Lake Washington. Once they arrived, they quickly learned that the 12-shell order was actually just one shell, because the university could not afford all 12 shells.
What was, just out of curiosity, what was the going price for a shell at that time?
I believe the Pocock brothers would have made $600 per shell. And so one shell, they would make $600, but it already cost them $500 to bring their father over from England. So they didn't really make a profit. Or they had to buy, as an artist, I know how much the materials cost. So it's probably very disappointing. So yeah, it was kind of a shock to learn that it was really only one shell for purchase. But that one shell sparked an interest in Pocock shells when it won the acclaimed Pacific Coast Championship in 1913. That was the same year that George left Vancouver and joined his brother and father in Seattle. There's a young Pocock.
There he is. Also, like, apparently just everyone that worked on the water was good looking back in the day.
That fresh air.
Yeah, it's like high and tight. Everyone just looking lean. You know, not eating enough. Oh, the glory days.
I know. So that first shell, because we're all about what the shells are named, it was named in honor of William Rogers. He was the owner of Rogers Candy and Ice Cream Company in Seattle. There was a lack of funding for new shells, which is why they only could afford one instead of 12. And Rogers donated $200 to the fund. So this is reminiscent of today, where boats are usually named after big donors to the university.
That makes sense.
I know. Can you imagine people actually fit into those shells?
Right. That's the thing. I guess along with everyone being surprisingly good looking, they were tighter than the average person. And so now I have a question. It seems like a lot of rowers are both lean but also tall. Yeah. Is that sort of the norm? It looks like you want a lanky rower.
Yeah, because that pull, you want it to be as long as possible so that each stroke gets you as far. But then the coxswains are usually very small. So in the 1900s, there were more men who were very small, but today they can use women. So on the UW rowing teams, the men's teams, they have a women coxswain.
Oh, that's awesome.
Tiny. All right, so I think you have a video of George in his shop.
Yeah, let's take a look at this guy just being awesome really quick.
3 pounds.
How long is it?
26 feet. And look at that wood, brother. You've almost got to worship it. The years it took to grow. And you know, you look at it and you see some years that it almost perished. Sometimes there'd be hardly a grain, that it practically was inert, didn't grow at all. And then moisture came again and away she went. There's a sense of fulfillment when you build a good boat, looking at it, a sense of fulfillment, of good craftsmanship. I don't care whether it's rowing or whether it's skiing or what. You've got to acquire a technique to fulfill that sense of good craftsmanship.
I love how just like cavalier he is about like the physical action of building one of these priceless craft. But at the same time, it's like he's in church. His reverence over the craft is just not something you encounter in the day-to-day. Like you don't go to like a Jiffy Lube and they're like, you got to admire the oil. It's a religious experience for me. Right? It's incredible to see a craftsman at work.
Yeah, once like those are just so delicate, and like one wrong move and you just like the boat is useless. How did something like this not sink? It's the big question. I have no idea. Especially with some of the racing boats where there's 8 full-grown men in them. I don't understand how they go. And they just sit right on the top of the water.
Right? And isn't it something about the oars as well provide buoyancy to the craft? Like being in it and then like actually having everyone almost like a water strider with the oars out keeps you somewhat aloft. But again,
take your word for it.
I'm a tour guide, not a physicist. I don't know what I'm saying half the time.
I don't build the boats personally, so I don't.
That's fair.
On that. But I imagine when they start rowing, they're just like floating, like barely touching the water. They're just going so fast.
Well, it's interesting. I actually, if you don't mind, I've got some vintage like 1930s rowing footage, which I think is pretty indicative of what they're doing here.
Yeah.
And so this is from rowingarchives.org, which is a thing for the avid mariner out there. But just look at them fly.
Yeah. And so in sync.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to steal your thunder if you're going to talk about the material that the pocock racing shells are made of by any chance.
No, that's all you.
Because one thing that I found particularly fascinating about these is that traditionally racing shells were being made with Spanish cedar. And that George's father, master boat builder, made all of his craft out of this Spanish cedar. But when he came, George came to first Vancouver, British Columbia area, and then down to the Seattle, Tacoma area. He really fell in love with North American cedar and was really inspired by a lot of the indigenous canoes out here, and found that it had properties that were unique from Spanish cedar, and actually made it stronger and lighter. And it was way more affordable than importing Spanish cedar. So he really launched his entire career off of this indigenous cedar down here.
Yeah, but before he found that cedar, he was also testing like tons of other wood that we have out here. So he was just trying out trees and seeing what worked best. And then he landed on that. And then he was like, this is my material.
Man,
yeah.
Just like tree dating out there. That's how he turned into this guy with his love affair with the boat.
That's awesome. I mean, look how light it is. He's just holding it. That's crazy.
Yeah, throwing around, what did he say? It was like 16 feet? I don't even remember how long he said in the clip back there. Yeah, phenomenal. And he just throws it around like it's like nothing, like a
tongue depressor.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
But yeah, so good stuff. He was definitely a master of his craft, and came from a long line of boat builders, it sounds like.
Yeah, and rowers too, because rowing started over in England and he just jumped right in. So he was a master. He wasn't just a master builder, but he knew the sport of rowing, which I think helped. And everyone came to him. They're like, why can't, like, I remember I was reading something and the crew, some people on the crew would like go up to him and they're like, why aren't I like making this work? And he would give them advice because he knew how the men worked with the boat and how the boat worked with the men. And so it's just wild.
Now, did he always do boats, or did he ever branch out onto anything else?
Well, since you mention it, in 1916, World War I started. So George and his brother Dick took a break from building boats because no one needed boats during that time. And they began building float plane pontoons for William Boeing and his new airplane company.
Well, there's a name I know.
I know. Yeah, Boeing is, I think, 103 years old now. And they started up here, just like all good things start up here in the Pacific Northwest.
So true.
Yeah, so they were building those, and I think they were building them in the shell house, if I remember correctly.
I believe that's true. And in fact, you can back me up on this. The University of Washington boat, the shell house, where we see the majority of his crafting footage, was originally built to be a float plane hangar, I think.
Oh. Actually, that's correct.
And we've got a clip of it as a plane hangar, and then currently as the boathouse down here as well, which I just love what they did with this transition. And you can see that it's still the 100-year-old building.
Yeah.
To this day.
Those vintage photos are so cool. It's just like looking at photos of Seattle back in the 1930s. It's so crazy. And then they're talking about Fremont and Queen Anne. I'm like, wait, that's just definitely not the Seattle I know now, but I know exactly where they're talking about.
Exactly, right? Same, but different.
Yeah. So after World War I, Dick Pocock decided to stay with Boeing, as a lot of people here do. But George returned to boat building. And the UW men's crew started winning races, starting from California all the way across the country to Poughkeepsie. So they were always hopping on trains and traveling across the country. And their biggest rivals were down in California at UC Berkeley. And so they were always just back and forth trying to win. And it was not long before Pocock was selling boats across the company as well. People started to think he was cheating because he had shops set up at UW, and so they thought he was like making them special boats. And then Internationally, he became recognized, and he would continue to build boats and sell them for over 50 years.
Wow. I mean,
Right.
and I feel like, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like pocock is just synonymous with rowing. It's almost like saying Nike when you're trying to say like tennis shoe. People understand what you're saying. It's just bananas how amazingly, I guess, influential he was on the sport, specifically in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, well, it's funny. It's like I didn't even know. Yes, UW does still have a rowing team. It's like you don't even know that rowing started or like where it started unless you look up Pocock's history. It's like he was born in England where racing started, but it's like no one really knows where these sports began.
Right?
Yeah, he is rowing.
Now, I have a clip of the actual pococks in the Foss Waterway Seaport. Do you mind if we chat briefly sort of about the innovations that pocock brought to boat building?
Yeah, let me go look for my notes on those.
Okay. I'll give you a second before I pull it up here, and hopefully your mic should be unmuted for this one, but I'll just double check on the bottom there because I don't want to cut you off at this point.
Yeah.
Here we go. So these are the ones that are actually in the Foss Waterway Seaport currently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is a 39-foot wooden racing shell. We don't really know anything about it. There's no serial numbers. There's no name. Even the pocock shell house like sticker on the back is ripped in half. But we're pretty sure it's a pocock. The shell itself looks very authentic. But all the hardware, like those oar locks and then the place where the shoes go, those look pretty new. So this is a double, and there's so 2 rowers would sit in it. So during Pocock's time as a master boat builder, he just continuously developed parts of the boat and making things faster, just like airplanes, right? If planes were still wooden, we probably wouldn't be flying in them as much. But he developed the sliding seats, lightweight oars, special oar locks, and a unique steering mechanism. And I think you had some notes on the steering mechanism or not?
Yeah, so when I was trying to do research about the steering mechanism, the first thing that pops up is a patent that he had for a kite steering carriage, like a buggy that you could sail essentially like with a Genoa and steer it that way. And he had all these dreams of like people having their wind-powered buggies throughout Europe. Needless to say, it didn't happen. Yeah. But I think he took some of that engineering, and it's a flat rudder. So, and I'm still confirming this, but I believe it was sort of flat and angled, and that it had an opportunity for there to be 4 steerage cables on it, so that the coxswain could actually do a little more precision maneuvering. But the trade-off on that was that you could over-correct and really steer too aggressively at times, just like a precision
out of control.
like your F-14. You do a lot more, but you have some higher risks involved with that.
The
so sliding
seat came up with a lot of stuff.
The fact that he invented the sliding seat.
I know. Well, like if I'm ever at the gym and I use the rower, like I never thought like it's like, oh yeah, sliding seat, you need to go back and forth. But that was Pocock's doing. So instead of just like being just sitting there and only using upper body, you're using your legs and you're using your back and your arms. And these were made for racing, but at the gym, it's just a full body workout. So it can go very beneficial to everybody, whether or not you're a rower.
And, you know, I think we actually have a quote from George Pocock himself about that synergy of motion, if you don't mind me interjecting again.
Yeah, go for it.
Take a look.
Torn down. There's the 1936 Olympic.
Well, I might have. Here we go. Here.
Rowing, you know, is not the uninitiated think it's strong back.
But boy, it isn't. It's a strong mind. You could tell that those men had their mind on their work. And when they don't, they're no crew.
He's got hours of this stuff. I love the way the man speaks.
Oh yeah.
But he does reference a lot that it was more than just muscling through it with the back or whatever, that he really wanted to create something that had a full body experience.
Yeah. Makes me want to become a rower.
Yeah. don't
Except
we
for the
all
winters on Lake Washington. Not ready for that. Okay.
Interesting. Well, I feel like I've derailed you here, and
No, it's fine. This is great. But we will start. Did you have something to say before I go?
no, go for it.
Oh, okay. So we talked about George coming to Seattle and starting his relationship with UW, and also making a name for himself, and then trying out airplanes, and then coming back to boats. So now we'll get into early 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1936, kind of setting the stage here. Yeah, in 1936, a Pocock racing shell took the international stage for the first time. So he was becoming more popular, especially in the United States, but internationally, no one had seen a Pocock. And so if you've not heard of the story of the boys in the boat, I highly recommend watching the PBS special, The Boys of 36. It's a quick 40-minute overview of a book that takes a little longer than 40 minutes to read, but it really dives into the history of the crew themselves, because they're just still college students, and it was there were no scholarships for rowing at UW during this time, so they had to work to help pay their way. So they had to keep up their grades, they had a part-time job, and then they were full-time rowing. And if any of you know what it's like to be an athlete in college, it's crazy. It's like my full-time student or a full-time athlete, and the sports always wins. But the coach, Al Ulbrichsen, he was very big on a well-balanced life. So even though he was pushing these guys every day, no matter what the weather, like being out on the lake when it's cold and rainy and windy, he also made sure that they were getting good grades and working towards having a better future after college. Because none of us know what we're doing after college.
No, that's true.
Yeah, right. So the book and the documentary are great. The book has a lot of pictures, but the great thing about the documentary are the video clips. And it's just cool to watch. It's cool how much footage they actually got in the 1930s. And it's fun to watch them just fly in real time. So you can read about it, and you can read about 1,000 regattas, but it's not the same as watching it.
And so just to make sure that I'm on the same page with everything here, The Boys of 36 is specifically about this University of Washington rowing team in a George Pocock racing shell going to compete in the International Olympics. I don't know why I had to say international. That's all Olympics.
Yeah.
And they had not just the tremendous pressure of being students and athletes, but competing on a global stage against Adolf Hitler's Nazi all-star team, basically, right? Yeah,
because in Hitler's mind, these were his Olympics. He had just risen to, his power or whatever, and he just wanted Germany and Italy to win everything. And so, the way he set up this, I can't even describe how, they got to Berlin and there were just Nazi flags everywhere, and it was just a totally different space, coming from Seattle, where no one really knows where Seattle is. They've never heard of it. It's a logging town. It's new, to going over to Germany during that time. But they made it. So Al Ulbrichsen, he just, for 4 years, he just had his mind, his eye on Berlin. Because in 1932, he just missed out on bringing his team to the Olympics. yeah, so at trials, they didn't make it. So then he was like, well, if I don't make it to the Olympics, like, what kind of coach am I? So he just worked these kids to the bone, and he would, yeah, I know. And he would evaluate and reevaluate and move them around. And like the freshmen would be faster than the varsity team, but then the varsity would come ahead. And so it was just changing constantly. And so he just was trying to figure out which team would go to the Olympics. 4 months before Berlin, he finally chose his varsity team. They went over to the East Coast and they qualified. So then they were going to Berlin. So then they took a big ship. They couldn't fly there. They grabbed their racing shell and they walked onto the ship, and they rode to the Olympics.
I didn't want to put it past them.
Oh, I know, right? Just more training. And then they made it to Berlin. And then, so the big day, there was time to hang out as much as you can hang out in Berlin at that time. And then there were, I guess, trials to qualify for that big finals day. So the day of finals, well, let me backtrack. So back to George Pocock and his shells. The one he built especially for the UW team for these Olympic Games was called the Husky Clipper, and it was an 8-oared wooden shell built by him. So they brought that on the ship with them, and then they would train with it in Berlin. There it is, hanging upside down. Is that the one? It's in the dining hall at UW right now. So that was their special shell. So on the day of finals, the USA team, they were assigned to lane 8. Lane 8 was the windiest lane. It was just screamed failure. Like, you're going to lose. You're in this lane. Oh. And then Germany and Italy, who both had the slowest qualifying times during prelims, they were assigned to lanes 1 and 2, which were the fastest lanes on the course. And like I was telling Chris earlier, in swimming these days, the fastest person is in lane 4. So you're always trying to figure out which one's lane 4, who's in the middle. But here at the games, lane 1's the fastest, lane 8 is the slowest. They do it nice and order for you.
Which is thank you for.
Right, I know. So Chris has a video, UW/USA. They're up at the top in lane 8. And it's a video of the whole race. But the start was horrible. Like, everyone had taken off and they were just still sitting there. But I'll let you guys watch it.
And I actually have a clip of George Pocock talking about the start of the race too. So we have a bounty of stuff to share with you. We'll start with that and then show you the race itself, because it's amazing.
Torn down. And there's the 1936 Olympic champion crew, one of Al's best crews.
Well, later in the program, we're going to see those gentlemen in action.
Boy, they were worth seeing too.
What's that?
And there's the finish of the 36 Olympics in Berlin. And Mr. Hitler was there to see that.
Wasn't there a little problem with the start of that race?
Yes, the wind was blowing against them, and it was before the days of bullhorns, of course, and the starter was a gentleman from Belgium by the name of Bischoff, and he had a furious mustache. And the starters in French, et vous prêt, partez, and all these vibrations coming through the mustaches kind of screened it or stopped it. Anyway, it was no fault of Bob's. He didn't get it. But he heard the British crew, which were right under his megaphone, start with their thole pins, and Bob started, but he was last off the mark.
It looked from that picture like a fairly close finish.
It was about 12 feet. Yeah, 12 feet.
And can I ask you one more thing? Why is it traditional that the French is the language they use for the start, or is this just one time?
No, well, I couldn't really answer that. French is understood all over Europe, and I suppose it's like what Latin is to law.
By far, my favorite part of that clip is where he just nonchalant is like, you know what, I don't know the answer to that, but here's the answer to that in perfect English. All right, you waited long enough. Here's the actual race itself. Truly extraordinary.
Die Entscheidung im Achter. Schweiz, Ungarn, England, Amerika, Italien und Deutschland. Zum ersten Mal bei den Olympischen Spielen hat sich ein deutscher Achter bis zur Entscheidung durchgekämpft. Italien kommt auf. Deutschland greift an. Deutschland holt auf. Zieht gleich. Die Wikinger gehen in Führung. Endkampf ist entbrannt. Die letzten 100 Meter. Das deutsche Boot im Vordergrund. Daneben mit weißem Stirntuch die Italiener. Dahinter die Ungarn. Neben diesen England. Auf der Außenbahn aber führt Amerika. Deutschland kommt auf. Meter um Meter. Zu spät. Zu spät. Amerika hat gesiegt. Erster Amerika. Zweiter Italien. Dritter Deutschland.
It's just bananas. I know how it ends, and I still get stressed out watching it.
Well, and it's like they show Bobby Mock, who's the coxswain for UW, for like a split second in like the 1930s version of a GoPro. I don't understand how they got those up close.
Very, a lot of questions about that. Yes.
Yeah. So they show him for a flash, but then the UW, you can't see the crew up until that last minute when they just come into screen. It's wild, but it's like you're still like, oh my god.
Yeah, as just some super compelling footage across the board.
Yeah.
Here's a good question: do you know how far that race extended?
I used to know. I know that they would do races that were like 10 or 15 minutes.
Wow.
But yeah, I should have looked that up to see how far that one was going.
Okay, well, we can figure it out. We are very close. Google and I are pretty tight. So
another video you can show while we look that up.
But what an upset across the board, not just in the like geopolitical sphere, but in the realm of rowing, because to be in the worst position, to have a late start, to have everything stacked against them, and to still just dominate. And I'm very comfortable saying that a huge part of that is through the tutelage and boat construction of George Pocock.
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So, yeah, awesome stuff.
So after the big win at Berlin, the American crews went on to win Olympic gold medals in 1948, 52, 56, 60, and 64, all in Pocock shells. So they were just dominating the rowing world. They weren't all 8-men races. I think there were a couple doubles and then some 4-men races. But, I mean, who cares? They're still winning.
Yeah. Honestly, yeah. Wow. Really, really sweet stuff right there.
Yeah.
I believe this is their trophy case from the 1936. But
a thing I remember from the book is they all had their UW sweaters, but then they just like put on their undershirts and stuff for the race because they didn't want to like ruin their nice UW sweaters, which is like totally understandable.
Living on a budget right now.
Right? I know. Don't ruin your nice white sweater. But then they would show photos of like the German team, and these guys were just huge, and they had been rowing together for over 10 years. And then it shows the photo of the UW guys, and they're like, "Hi, we're 19," or however old they were.
Yeah, no joke, right? Like, geez, I wish I had a picture of the German team. I'm sure I can find something in a second there.
Well, then everyone should go watch the documentary. It's awesome.
Yeah, documentary and book, both phenomenal recommendations.
Yeah, especially because it's local. Everything they talk about is local. These guys are from here. Yeah, it's great. One of the guys on the team, the summer before the Olympics, he went and helped build Grand Coulee Dam. So like these guys were still out working, you know, making an honest living. Yeah, it's
just
awesome.
Amazing, right?
Yeah.
Well, now, do you want to talk a little? I think I've got some clips here, which we should be able to talk through, but of the additional pocock racing shells that are in the seaport as well.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's talk about those. Yeah. So there are 3 shells. Kind of mentioned the one on the floor. Surprisingly, it's not hanging up because I feel like it's an unspoken rule to display racing shells hanging up. But the long boat hanging up there is a 60-foot, 8-oared wooden shell. It's named the Nelson Wallstrom, and it was new to the University of Washington during the 1973-74 season. George Pocock was a wood shell purist throughout his career, which we talked about. And the first wooden pocock racing shell was sold to the UW in 1912, the one named after the candy guy. And so the Wallstrom would have been one of the last. He retired in 1970 and he died in 1976. Wow. And by 1970, nearly every boat in collegiate rowing was a wooden pocock. So the Wallstrom, so the Wallstrom is a battalion model pocock. In my head, they all look the same, but apparently there are different models. This one was originally designed for the U.S. Naval Academy. The incoming class at the Naval Academy was required to take rowing, and these shells were easier for the non-experienced rowers because they are fuller in the bottom. So I think they float easier and they're just easier to row. The varsity teams at UW love rowing these boats because they were nice and easy. So they would train in these boats in the fall and then hand them over to the freshman team for the winter and spring seasons. And then they would use their other boats. I don't know. I don't want to call them more advanced, but they're not the beginner boat, I guess.
Right. The more maneuverable, faster, more difficult to use boats.
Yeah, you have to use more of your body than just like floating there and let the boat do its work for you. So the Wallstrom was named after Nelson Wallstrom, who was Dick Wallstrom's father. So Dick Wallstrom was a bronze medalist at the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, along with 4 other UW rowers. So they were in one of the smaller boats. Awesome. His dad, all I could find on him was like a scanned document from UW. He was the business manager and comptroller at the UW in the early 1950s.
Interesting.
So, yeah, I don't know why it was specifically named after him, but I assume just the legacy of the Wallstrom. Race length is 2,000 meters. Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
There we have it. See?
Cool. Yeah.
Yes. The answer to this one is yes. You can. Currently, the Foss Waterway Seaport is opening under some new guidelines. But yeah, the shells are available to see in person right now.
Yeah, when you walk in, if it's the same as it was back in March, when you walk in, they're almost right to the left, directly to the left.
I was like, I love it.
Yeah,
I believe that is
ceiling decoration there. So along with the Wallstrom, 2 boats were donated to the UW, the Wallstrom and its sister ship, the John Bracken. quick history on that one. John Bracken was a varsity rower in 1940, but he had tragically died in a sailing accident on Lake Washington in 1942. But he was well loved and well respected and just like an overall really nice guy. The Bracken racing shell, it is hanging. Of course, it's hanging at the Ram restaurant in Newville. But I just read a headline that the Ram is permanently closed due to COVID. I think it was one of those restaurants that just couldn't keep up their business. So I don't know what's going to happen to the Bracken. Maybe the Foss can take it and have those two sister ships together. But we'll see. And then
I think we've got. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's like John Bracken during his time in the. Ooh. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. I spun for a minute, so I didn't know if I got cut off. The freshman crews were nearly undefeated. Were undefeated nearly every season in the 70s and early 80s in the Wellstrom and the Bracken. So they were pretty good boats and pretty fast teams. They kept winning. And then the third boat that is hanging up at the seaport, it overlaps, it kind of crosses with the Wallstrom, but it's shorter. It is a 30-foot 2-oared vintage wooden racing shell, also from the early 70s. So all three boats are about from the same era. The history of this shell was kind of impossible to track down. The UW type lettering is used on both the Wallstrom and the Walter Mitty. It kind of looks like purple block letters with gold border around it. Classic UW lettering. But I had it confirmed that the Walter Mitty was never a name, like that name was never used. Yeah, there we go. Oh, my screenshot. So you can kind of see the Walter Mitty and then the Nelson Wallstrom. The lettering. Oh, I said the opposite. It's the gold lettering with kind of a black purple. But UW never had a racing shell called the Walter Mitty during their rowing history. And then someone I talked to, he let me know that there's the Walter Mitty Rowing Center, and it was established by physicians down in Tacoma as a master's rowing club. So it was the older guys. It happens with swimming too. Like once you are done swimming, you kind of go on to a master's team. I'm still
here. Don't worry. Just
okay.
Switching over.
You went black, and I was like, oh, no.
I won't abandon you. I promise.
Okay, good. I don't have any of the tech on my end, so I don't. So the Walter Mitty Rowing Center was established by physicians in Tacoma for a master's team. So we think that that's where the shell was from before it made its way to the seaport. So it's unfortunate we don't have more history on it, but and then the third one, like I said earlier, there's no identifying markers on it, no serial numbers. On the Pocock Shell Center website, they have kind of an identifier calculator, so you can like put in the serial number and it will pull up the history on it. But unfortunately, these three shells don't have serial numbers. So that was a useless tool. But if you ever come across a Pocock and it has them, definitely look up the history.
Absolutely.
So I think that's all I have. I just have one quote from George Pocock, and then I'll let you take the floor, Chris. George Pocock said, "It's a great art is rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of motion. And when you're rowing well, why, it's nearing perfection. And when you reach perfection, you're touching the divine. It touches the you of yous, which is your soul." So just imagine I was a man and I was British and I said it beautifully.
I feel like we've heard enough quotes from him tonight. I heard it perfectly in my mind.
Yeah, so there you go.
Well, that's honestly a tough act to follow. I only have a couple things to really add to anything, but I did, while I was looking into this whole thing, think it was interesting just the amount of like, I don't know, how rowing is the family business. You know, it was like the family religion. They were devout to it in so many ways. So this is Stan Pocock, George's son, who continued the tradition of boat building, and he is responsible for the first fiberglass and carbon fiber boat shells, the racing shells in the world, I believe.
Yeah.
Which is nuts when you think about it. And I've got this cool clip. So the Bainbridge Island Center, the Stan Pocock Rowing Center, which is about education and development and preservation of history, is currently restoring with volunteers. I think it's a like 60-foot. We'll double check in the clip here, but just looking at the craftsmanship is amazing. And the fact that he took his grandfather and father's knowledge about boat crafting and then innovated with it is very telling and right on brand. So we'll take a look here. It's pretty cool stuff.
Living up.
It's an enormous racing shell.
I have a couple
Why
thoughts.
is it that long?
Of course, it's going to hang on the ceiling. And then could you imagine watching that, like 16 people and like one pull, just how far that would go? It'd go from Kenmore to Renton. It would just be like one length of it. It's like that's all it would be. Yeah, that's wild.
That one you could row to the Olympics in Europe, no big deal. The other character, so Stan is obviously an institution in the rowing world, but it's Lucy Pocock that really caught my eye with this whole thing. So Lucy, pictured here, is George's oldest sister, and unfortunately their mother died, and so she really assumed the role of like caretaker to the family. So that's George Pocock in the middle of the photo there, and Lucy on the top right. She was always tall. She capped out at 6 feet, but she was a titan of the industry, and she really was pioneered women's rowing. Back in England, it wasn't really acceptable for a woman to row by herself, and there certainly were no all-female teams, but you could do mixed doubles, whereas a woman and a man rowing with a woman coxswain. And then she really became very successful in that, and then went to single rowing for a period and actually won some championships in the early 1900s. And she was doing this in full-length wool skirts with a corset. Oh. And people always talk about one of the championships she won. She, like, I think it was just like half a boat length, blasts across the finish line and then faints, passes out. And people always focus on that, like, she passed out. Can't have done this. But I'm like, yeah, she was wearing a like whalebone corset doing full rowing.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. But
there's no give.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So she was really instrumental in allowing women to be seen as strong enough to be professional rowers and competitive rowers, and then went on to coach the University of Washington women's team in 1913. So here she is with one of her trophies, and then starting this program here. And I think you could see it in one of the first ones. So women weren't allowed to go in the like streamlined pocock shells that we've seen up to now. They had to be in these barges here, you know, to accommodate all the.
Look at the bench he's sitting on.
Right. This is the other thing.
Park bench.
For a period of time, women couldn't do certainly in the United States and definitely the University of Washington, they couldn't do competitive racing. They could do show racing, which was about how good they looked doing it and their form. And then they had to, row some guy around in the bench, which was not strong enough to race on their own, but strong enough to like barge some guy around Lake Washington.
And he's not doing anything. He's just sitting there. Wow.
Brutal. But she was also really instrumental in George's success down in the University of Washington, because unlike Pocock Sr., their father that they brought over with the $500 from their first earnings, she paid her own way with her winnings from that championship on the River Thames.
That's awesome.
She arrived and then financially supported her brother, working as the cook for the rowing teams out there. And that's actually how she ends up meeting her husband, is that every morning she would row across, I believe it was Lake Union, to go to the grocer and then row herself back to University of Washington. And every morning he would go down, he was helping to build the canal down there, and he just saw her and he's like, holy smokes. Oh, that's a woman. And so introduced himself and they fell in love. And I think at the time too, he was a widower. He had like 3 children and they ended up having 2 of their own.
Oh, wow.
But she's not only the reason that women's rowing was allowed with the University of Washington, but she led the women's team to several successes and then really established the fact that you could do more than just be pretty and row. So she brought it up. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, and I know that you know a ton about this as well, but the Husky Clipper, right? One that the University of Washington team used to destroy Nazi Germany in the Olympics, was on loan to Pacific Lutheran University for a period of time, wasn't it?
Yeah. The UW let them borrow it to kickstart their rowing program in the 1960s. So they would train in it, and then they won a couple races. They won a big one against the University of Puget Sound and Seattle University. So, you know, those local rivalries. In 1963, UW decided they wanted the shell back to, surprise, hang it from the ceiling.
Oh my gosh.
They wanted to display it in the shell house that was on campus right on the shores of Lake Washington. So the PLU crew team brought the Husky Clipper back, and then UW said, okay, well, here, we'll give you another shell. So they gave them the Loyal Shouty, which I have no history on it besides its name. And the only way for these guys to get it back to Tacoma was to row it. So, so they rowed from Seattle to Tacoma. It was 43 miles in December on Puget Sound. And the waves were just, I mean, there's no space between you and the water. And the waves were just crashing in. And the trip took 9 hours. But they did it. And I think that's awesome. So you can go win Berlin, or you can have like a crazy bonding experience rowing 43 miles.
Because what I love about this, aside from being a PLU graduate myself, is that all of these guys were just like broke. They had to fund all of the rowing on their own, and they couldn't afford a transport down, right?
Yeah, it was cheaper than a train. It only took 9 hours of all your strength and mental health to do. But yeah, I just think that's amazing. Yeah.
December air. And what I learned that I thought was cool, so 2 things. They got a parade permit so that they could, when they landed in Point Defiance, carry the pocock, or well, not the pocock, but the racing shell down to American Lake. And their dream was to actually get it closer, to go under the Narrows, but the weather was so bad that they actually landed in Point Defiance, and the Coast Guard brought a land to water tank carrier, beached it in Point Defiance, let them carry the boat up on, and then sailed them down closer so that they could get out and then march it across to American Lake in December. Just crazy people.
Oh, wow.
And what's awesome is I'll share
in December. I know.
Yeah,
it's like,
right?
how many sweaters were they allowed?
Well, not their white ones, because you don't want to get those
Not
dirty.
their white ones, no.
And I believe
Go
that
Lutz.
particular boat, they renamed the Sleipnir, which is the name of Odin's 8-legged horse that he rides across the cosmos.
Oh,
the more you know.
Good fact.
Right? Just as an homage to that Norwegian history. So I think, I mean, those are the coolest stories I've got about everything. I don't know if you want to interject anything.
I mean, that was it, just to hear about Lucy. So, yeah.
So if you guys have any additional
I was
questions.
saying the whole thing was worth it just to hear about Lucy.
Man, Lucy, she's my kind of hero. I'm all about that. Supporting the family, smashing gender norms, breaking the glass ceiling, rowing your way everywhere. It's a very like Thea Foss.
Right. Sorry, my
success story. I love it. Well, if you guys have enjoyed your time tonight, two things. Please go check out the Foss Waterway Seaport. If you feel like tipping your guides tonight, there is a PayPal link on the front page of prettygrittytours.com. You can always tip your guides. Leah and I will share those tonight and buy delicious ramen and great rowing sweaters. I don't know what we'll find. And if you guys are interested in finding out more about Leah and her art, I'm going to share the link to your Instagram tonight, because I know you do some really cool stuff. Let's see if I can actually find it in here. Here we go. Here we go. Very on brand with the nautical theme, which I really appreciate. And you've got some cool stuff in there. So you have an Etsy page as well, don't you?
I have a Redbubble page.
Okay, perfect.
So some of my designs are on Redbubble, so you can get it printed on stickers or T-shirts or mugs. Yeah, stickers are very popular on that site. Everyone loves just like random stickers for water bottles.
No, I know I will personally be buying some of those, so watch out. Well, sweet. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Leah.
Yeah, this was fun. And thanks everyone who watched. I haven't been watching the chat because I didn't want to like get distracted, but I hope I had a good time.
You'll have to go back through it. There were some really good comments and questions tonight. So I appreciate everyone joining us. A huge thank you to Columbia Bank and the Foss Waterway Seaport. And we will see you next third Thursday. If I'm not mistaken, I'm already mistaken. We're going into the archives next time and looking at some of the nautical treasures that have been kept away from daylight in the seaport itself. So it should be a pretty exciting one.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And keep on exploring, friends. I'll see you soon.
Good night, everybody.